Again, you can use the chat feature on the right to introduce yourselves. We'd like to know who's here and what brings you to this call. So if you want to use the chat feature to tell us your name and your organization, where you're from, and one question that you have about youth organizing and voter engagement. So a reminder that this webinar is part of SCYO's Youth Corps program. Youth Corps is the Youth Community Organizing and Resource Exchange. The goal of Youth Corps is to provide regular opportunities for youth organizing groups from all over the country to come together across issues and geography and organizational forms to learn from each other and to develop shared strategies for building real power. Youth Corps includes these regular webinars, a national convening that I know that some of you were at in Durham, North Carolina a few weeks ago, and we're now in the process of planning the next convening and developing some other ways for youth organizing groups to continue to connect with each other. So this webinar is focused on youth organizing and voter engagement. The 2016 elections are coming up, and we thought that this was a good time to discuss how youth organizing groups are incorporating voter engagement into their plans to build power. So we'll share some lessons, and we have two great youth organizers who will be sharing their thoughts on how they see this voter engagement work as part of a larger strategy to build power. Just tech notes again. The participants will be on mute, but you can use the chat feature to ask questions or make comments or engage with each other. And again, for those folks that are just joining in now, please use the chat to introduce yourselves and just tell us who you are and your organization, and if you have a particular question about youth organizing and voter engagement. So just to provide a little bit of framing of how we get into this conversation. So the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing has focused mainly on supporting youth organizing groups that work with middle school and high school students. And in the past, for the most part, these groups did mainly issue-based organizing and stayed away from elections for many of them. But 2 years ago, we did a field scan and found that a significant number of youth organizing groups were incorporating voter engagement into their work. And when we dug a little deeper, we found that a set of these groups were producing really credible voter engagement numbers while also winning significant local policy changes and developing lifelong leaders. We also found that these groups have a really unique advantage over a lot of other groups that do voter engagement. If you look at who does canvassing and who does voter engagement work, across the board, it's almost always young people. But youth organizing groups have the ability to pull on a pool of young leaders who've already been engaged in several years of leadership development and political development activity and campaign activity. So their youth leaders are able to speak to unlikely voters in an authentic way that is totally unmatched by other kinds of voter engagement. We think there's a lot of great opportunities around being involved in voter engagement. First, the demographic shift that's going on in this country means that young people of color are a critical part of and growing part of the electorate. Some people credit young people of color with winning the last two presidential elections, with being the crucial swing votes. This creates an opportunity for youth organizing groups to become the experts in reaching this powerful and important demographic. We should also mention that there is money out there from civic engagement funders and political donors for voter engagement work. But this work is not without challenges. It's not just a slam dunk for youth organizing groups to get involved in voter engagement work. Many groups are wary about getting involved in a political system that they know is corrupt in so many ways and controlled by large financial interests. There are really complex laws and data systems to doing voter engagement work that can be a little bit intimidating. And we know that civic engagement funders tend to have really high expectations of folks to produce significant numbers, and that can feel a little bit intimidating as well. the last thing I'll say in framing this is that the last couple of years have seen youth-led social movements playing really powerful roles, whether it's the movement for Black Lives or for immigrant rights or to end the school-to-jail pipeline. Youth-led movements have been highly visible. At the same time, the 2014 midterm elections saw the lowest youth voter turnout in recent history. So a question is it possible to build a link between movement organizing, issue organizing, and voting that can build the independent political power of young people, communities of color, and working people overall? And that's a question that we want to explore on this webinar. First, before we go to our panel, we wanted to do a quick poll. And I think, if you look on your screen now, there's a link to a poll. And if you can click that link, it's in the chat feature now. So you should just be able to click that link. This is a little bit of a test. The Fuse does not have its own built-in poll feature, as some webinars do. But if you click the link that's in the chat feature, it'll take you to a poll. And if you can quickly fill out the poll, we just want to get a sense of who's on and what your experience is in doing voter engagement. So quickly fill out the poll and click Submit. And after you click Submit, you can click See Previous Responses. And if you click that and then refresh it, you'll be able to see the responses of everybody who's on the poll. So I'll give everybody just a second to do that, and we just want to get a sense of who's on. Right? And if you refresh the page, the results page. So currently, what I'm seeing of the folks that are on, let's see, about 60% currently do voter engagement, 27% don't but are interested. One group that does not do it. And of the kinds of voter engagement that people are doing, looks like most common is voter education events, but it's a real mixture of different strategies that people are using. And on the question of what is the greatest obstacle, more than half of the people say that lack of funding. About 30% saying questions about whether voting can lead to real change, and then a couple people talking about funder expectation and complexity of laws and process. So thank you all for sharing that feedback. With that, I'm going to move us on to our panel. So we have two youth organizing groups that have been really involved in issue-based work as well as voter engagement, here to share their experiences. First, we have Jenny Arwade is the Executive Director of Communities United in Chicago. They've done some amazing organizing around education, immigration, and housing, among other issues, and have also been really active in some recent voter engagement work. And Aliyah Sharif is the Director of Civic Engagement for the Ohio Student Organization. And they've done some great voter engagement while also playing a leading role on police accountability, and in addition to helping to host the Movement for Black Lives convening in Cleveland this last summer. So let me first turn it over to you, Jenny. And if you can say give us a little bit of background on your organization, how and why you got into voter engagement, and how you see this fitting into your organization's theory of change.
Great. So hi, everyone, and thanks, Eric. So Communities United, so we're an organization that was founded in 2000. So we're an intergenerational movement building organization. And so we work really holistically around issues like Eric mentioned: affordable housing, education, justice, health access, and affordable housing. And we work citywide and statewide in the state of Illinois, both through our own base building work and community organizing, as well as through different alliances that were part of, like Voice and the Campaign for Common Sense Discipline. So our organization, again, we're intergenerational. So a lot of our work has been focused, for example, around the school to prison pipeline, working to pass statewide legislation recently to fundamentally dismantle the school to prison pipeline and address the role of school-based arrests and police in schools in Illinois. And we've done a lot of work around getting Fannie Mae to sell foreclosed rental properties, for example, to prevent the displacement of communities of color across Chicago. So we work in a variety of areas, and our organization has evolved a lot over the years. We're very committed to kind of a holistic theory of change that focus on a few different things. So when we think about what it's going to take for us to create change in all of the areas that our communities care about, we think about the multiple strategies that are needed. So direct action is a core part of our work, leadership development and base building. We do a lot of intentional Black, Brown alliance building, both through our organizing campaigns, but then also separate through different relationship building spaces, and then voter engagement and civic engagement also being a key part. And really over the years, 2004 was the first year that we really began doing comprehensive voter work. And over the years, it's led to really concrete local and state level victories around housing, immigrant rights, health access, education equity, and justice reinvestment is kind of the newer area where we're engaging in voter work. So for us, it was a critical strategy to really adopt and embrace, because in the beginnings, we were finding that through our direct action, our base building, and other issues, that in the very entrenched machine politics in Chicago, that we needed to figure out other ways that we were going to be able to get the attention of our public officials and to be able to turn some of the fiercest opponents of our work into people who are actually going to champion the issues in our communities. So in 2004, when we began, it was right around the years when the machine politics in Chicago was beginning to face a lot of more scrutiny and come under investigation through outside probes into hiring practices and scandals in the city of Chicago. And so at that point, many of our elected leaders had really relied on being able to basically, again, give jobs to folks in the community to be able to then get out the vote for them. So for us, we were able to see, I know a little bit later in the agenda, we'll be telling stories about how we've been able to use voter work to really advance our issues. But for us, it's been a transformative process because we've been able to, again, like I mentioned, turn some of our biggest opponents into leading some really significant change on all the issues that I talked about. So that's a really brief background. I know we'll go into more of the nuts and bolts in a minute, but I'll pass it over to Alwia.
Great. Yeah, Alwia, can you just tell us a little bit about your organization and how you got into this work?
Definitely, definitely. So my name is Alwia. I am the Civic Engagement Director with the Ohio Student Association. And I put up a little slide here just in case. um, for me, we are a grassroots community organizing group that's really intersectional, right? So we have all kinds of people in our organization, and it started from like a really student work background, working around higher education issues and more funding for our public schools. Um, and as we realized like we wanted to do more long-term organizing, we started working on different types of issues that really affect our community. So one of the things that we started working on is the zero tolerance policies here in the state of Ohio. Um, and okay, I was trying to move it here. That is not my slide. Yeah,
Oh, yeah, I'll get it back for you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Zero tolerance policies and working on just getting more funding in the state of Ohio to public education. We really focus, kind of like what Jenny had shared. We focus on direct action is something that we work on. We worked on the movement for Black Lives. Really worked hard on lifting up John Crawford, Tanisha Anderson, Tamir Rice's name after all the police shootings were happening. But we also saw that We sort of got tired of just like, doing the marches and the rallies and shouting outside the buildings, and rather than like really figure out a different way to make more impactful change, right? I think there's a role for everybody. So there's definitely a role for the direct action, but we also saw a need for young people to get civically engaged, and we saw what happened in 2008 and 2010, a little bit in 2012. Um, so civic engagement has become like a core part of the way that we organize, and we see it more of a supporting tool for the organizing that's happening on the ground. We are a statewide organization, so there's different types of campaigns that go on in each city. So how does civic engagement really play a support, like is a support for the work that's happening, and really connecting those two is something that we've been okay at, but we definitely need to get better. So I'm excited to keep talking with y'all, and so we can figure it out.
Great. And, well, let me stick with you for a minute. And can you just give us a little bit more detail on the kinds of voter engagement that you've done, and how does it fit into your other work?
For sure. So what we've done is in 2014, it was the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, or sorry, yeah, the March on Washington, and the idea was to really bring back Freedom Summer. So what we did was try to connect what happened 50 years ago to what was happening at that time, and really bringing that aspect of it, where, like I said earlier, specifically around the police issues, is we need to be registered to vote in order to actually affect what's happening with and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on. Right now, I'm working on college campuses. So what we do is we reach out to the different organizations on campuses. We do class reps. So we actually go into the classrooms and talk to students about why it's important. It's really like 5 minutes, register them to vote. And we're also thinking about expanding that into high schools as well.
Great. Jenny, do you want to give us a little bit more examples of the kinds of voter engagement work that you've done and how it fits into the rest of your work?
Yep. And Alvia, should I move through your slides and then we can go back to them? Great. For us, so like I mentioned, in 2004, we began doing voter work and civic engagement. So when we started in our first effort, we were able to reach about 5,000 voters with about 75 youth leaders and adult allies who were leading the efforts. And then we've grown so that in this past election between Mayor Emanuel and Chuy Garcia, who was the challenger, we were able to reach about 26,000 voters across the Northwest side. Sorry, I hear a little bit of noise. Was someone trying to answer the question, or? And so we've been able to think strategically about how we grow the efforts in sustainable ways, as well as how we keep ensuring that the civic engagement is really driving the change that folks want to see. So a really quick example of the type of way that we've seen civic engagement impact our organizing. So several years ago, we won the Keep Chicago Renting Ordinance. And a lot of that work had started years ago around preventing displacement, when one of our youth leaders, who was 13 years old, he basically had sheriffs show up in his apartment building in the middle of the night, kicking out his family and evicting them from their homes for no reason. And he was basically physically abused and assaulted. He was not allowed to provide translation to his parents, who were monolingual Spanish speakers. And he also wasn't allowed to call the organization that he was connected to for help. So out of that, we were able to really look at the issue of how many families were in foreclosed rental buildings in Chicago. We ended up doing a big action against Sheriff Dart that got international attention, because then, as a result of that action by young people, he created a moratorium on foreclosure evictions. So out of that work, we were beginning to look at what policies we could pass in order to be able to protect tenants and keep them in their homes. So the Keep Chicago Renting Ordinance, it's one piece of the puzzle, but it basically says that if a building is foreclosed, that a bank either has to offer tenants leases to stay or give them over $10,000 per family in order to move. Um, and we were able to pass this in June of 2013 with an overwhelming 45 votes in favor of it. And so now Chicago is the second largest city in the country to have this type of renter protections. And then we were able to pass further amendments to strengthen the ordinance. And really, that evolved both, again, out of a combination of really elevating this issue through direct action. But as I mentioned before, in 2004 was the first year that we conducted our first Get Out the Vote campaign. And so it was through that effort that we were able to move Alderman Mell, who was our local alderman. He was one of the most entrenched kind of machine politics guys you could get here in the city, but he happened to be the person representing the majority of our base at that time. We were able to move him to be the chief sponsor of this legislation. And that was really key because the banks obviously were extremely opposed to this effort, but because we were able to get a very unlikely ally to champion it, we were able to get 45 folks in favor. And again, dealing with the city council in Chicago, that was pretty unheard of. So that was an example of where the civic engagement resulted in concrete victories that we've been able to continue to build off and preserve a lot of rental units for families living in Chicago. And we've also grown our efforts to reach more numbers then because we saw the value. So for example, again, like I mentioned, we engaged 26,000 voters in this last election, and we were able to document significant increases of 25 to 46% in different wards where we were doing outreach. And as a result of that, we were able to get, again, all of our elected officials to vote against the mayor's budget, which is, again, in Chicago unheard of. We were also able to get officials to start opposing charter expansion very strongly in our neighborhoods, which also was unheard of in terms of the electeds that we were dealing with. And then we were also able to see a lot of other major accomplishments. So we have always used, we don't have binding referendum in Illinois, but we have non-binding referendum. And so young people really have helped to lead the way to get people to get questions on the ballot. So for example, we were able to put a question on the ballot around nonprofit hospitals and their use of tax breaks in terms of serving the undocumented. And through that effort, we were able to get statewide legislation to expand the access to charity care for the undocumented in nonprofit hospitals across the state. So those are some examples. Later we'll talk again about challenges and other things with the work, but for those reasons, we've really been committed to building out our voter engagement program.
That's great. And so, Jenny, maybe I can just stick with you for a second, and you can just talk a little bit about what do you see as the strengths and challenges of doing this voter engagement work and combining it with the other kinds of organizing you're doing?
Yeah. So I think that the strength is that when it's combined with other tactics and strategies, that it's an amazing leadership development tool, and it also produces the results that we've been working to get on different campaigns where we've really hit roadblocks. The civic engagement has helped to be one transformative lever to really make major inroads. I think that there are a lot of challenges. So for example, one, we have non-binding referendums. So of course we can do all this work to pass referenda, but then they're not binding in Illinois. So there's still a huge amount of work to do. If you're under 18 in Illinois, for example, you also cannot get petitions signed to get a question on the ballot. So with all of our base building work, we've really had in our civic engagement work, and also you have to be a U.S. citizen to be able to get questions on the ballot as well. So a lot of our work is really focused on, that intentional, intergenerational, and different types of alliance building because there is so much disenfranchisement within the voting system. So recognizing that on the front end has to be built into our model about how we then broaden out the scope of who can be engaged and make sure that happens. And then also it takes a lot of resources to be able to do effectively. And I think that for many, if you're not a more, well-established statewide organization, for example, it can be a lot harder to attract those national resources unless they're passed through. So I think that that's another challenge, is really being able to resource the work in a sustainable way, in addition to the ways we've been able to do for our general organizing work.
Great. Alia, can you talk a little bit about from your experience, what you see as the strengths and challenges of doing this voter engagement work?
Yeah, for sure. I think kind of like what Jenny said, some of the strengths are the fact that it is a great leadership development tool. It's a way, with OSA, we also, a part of our Theory of Change is building leaders. So we do have a fellowship that goes on every semester. And for us, it's like a great way for the fellows to go through and really practice those organizing skills, because we do know that young people don't believe in voting. I was one of those people. I was sharing this with Eric that last year I thought that voting was not helpful whatsoever. I just did not see the point of it. I would literally hide out like when people went canvassing. And then through the experience of last year of organizing, I really saw it as something that could help shift the narrative, especially in Columbus, in the state of Ohio, because young people don't vote. And that's just what the system is caring about right now. So that is a strength, is really um, having that conversation with young people to the point where like they actually see the benefit of doing this type of work, and also knowing that if you are trying to change a system as is, you kind of have to work with the system at first. So some of the strengths are being able to develop those leaders, being able to have those conversations with the community, and really it could also be a great way to survey the community. We haven't done it as long as y'all have in Chicago, so for us it's really been about being able to. We have block cards, right, where we use that as a way to talk to people. What do you care about? It goes from you care about jobs and economy to housing to fair hiring policies, and then being able to have that conversation to connect it to why voting is important. So it's been helpful for our organizing tactic into tying it to something a lot more tangible. And it's been also helpful in getting us in more communities than just Ohio, than only universities, but actually getting us out into the communities has been a huge strength. And yeah.
Great. Great. And if folks have questions that you want to ask of either of the guests, you can go ahead and put your questions in the chat feature, and we can direct your questions to them. One more question from me: is there anything that you all can say about what does it take? I think 50% of the folks said that the biggest obstacle to them was figuring out how to fund this work. What would you say about what does it take to resource this work to be able to do it well?
You can go first.
Sure. So I think that for us, being able to, so I just saw a question about addressing where you find the funding to support the work. So in the beginning, we were really only able to access funding through an established statewide organization that was able to get national funding. This was through a lot of the immigrant rights funding nationally, when there was a lot of resources going into specific civic engagement work around immigrant rights issues at the time. And so through coalition that we were part of, we were able to get, there was what was called a New American Democracy Project. And so we were able to really learn how to do the work and also get a fellow as part of the process back in 2004. So these were folks who were able to get stipends to be fellows and do this very, very intensive, long hours coordinating all of our voter work. But then, of course, we put a lot of organizational resources into it because all of our organizers and members really needed to go all in, even though we weren't funded directly to do the work, in order to make it successful. And then over the years, we've been able to then raise more grassroots fundraising from our membership base, which we found to be really critical to supporting the work. And then this past year, because we had a more exciting race, around Emmanuel and the challenger Chuy Garcia, we were actually able to get our first major donors. So we were able to access a $20,000 individual donation and also a $12,000 individual donation, which for us was pretty huge because it was the first time we as an organizing group had ever been able to access, again, larger donor support in that way. But it's still a challenge. We've also, this past year, when we engaged a much larger number, 26,000 voters, we also were able to get some union support from our allies. But I think that, again, with all of these different types of support, there are different, strengths and challenges that go along with it. So we are always having to navigate some of those issues within it. And in addition to the funding, I think in the beginning, a huge learning curve was just even getting the data systems and technology and the use of VAN up and running. So now we're able to do that very independently. But I know when we first started, that was a huge learning curve for us in terms of identifying voters and being able to really poll them and track that in an efficient manner to use in our organizing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I second everything Jenny just said. Just to add on for us, also being a part of the statewide organization, like the Ohio Organizing Collaborative has been a huge effort. And I think just the fact that we've also incorporated it as a part of our theory of change in our mission statement has made it a lot easier to go to funders and ask for money. We're also part of a national network called the Bus Federation that do specifically civic engagement work. I'd encourage, especially people that are organized with young people. They're a great resource. So it's the Bus Federation. You should Google them, and I think they could be really helpful as well.
Great. And if folks have other questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. We have one here that just came in from Allison Barlow. It says, how do traditional voter engagement activities differ, if they do, from youth voter engagement efforts? So are there ways, like in your work, to what degree are you specifically targeting young voters versus engaging young people in reaching voters of all ages? And if you're specifically trying to reach young voters, how is that different?
Definitely. I mean, for us, it's really just the way you communicate, right? You communicate with young people differently. And I just ran our first civic engagement program here in Columbus at the Ohio State University, and we registered almost 6,000 students. And for us, a huge way of just really just having a conversation with people. Like I mentioned earlier, we have block cards, which are sort of like it's just a card that says like, what issue are you interested in? What are you willing to change the world for? And then from there, just starting a conversation with them, and then really being able to engage them into the organizing that's already happening on the ground. I think that doing a lot of parties, a lot of potlucks, actually going to where the students are and where the young people are, and just really speaking their language. I mean, I'll be honest, sometimes I feel like people make it a little bit too complicating than it needs to be. It's really just engaging young people and organizing them right into understanding why this type of work is really critical into changing the world into what they want to see.
And I would agree with that. And then I think that for us, in terms of some of the adult voter engagement, of course, we're always working to bring new folks in as leaders and as volunteers in the organization, but there is kind of, when you're reaching huge numbers of folks, it's kind of like the trying to get 3 direct contacts with folks and all that. And I think with young voters, there's a lot more energy put into kind of that ongoing engagement because folks want to be in relationship. and to be connected to this work, I think, at a deep level, as do older adults, as we're doing the outreach. But I think that as we're working with, the older high school age youth and then also on college campuses, those aspects that were mentioned around potlucks, political education sessions, things like that become a even more critical part of the strategy for engagement.
Right. Another question here about, are there any other methods that you're using to reach hard to reach individuals? And I wonder if you have any feedback on this idea, like many people talk about, particularly, talk about young people, talk about low-income people of color as, in the voter work, it's often described as, as these are infrequent voters, right? What have you found out about, about reaching out to folks who are often considered to be like, infrequent voters?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a program that's also being running called LPV, which is propensity voters, which are just that people that have registered to vote and voted in 28, but they haven't voted since then. And for us, it's really, you can use data, right? So Van, there's other systems. I don't know all of them. Like we use a system called Blocks that was specially created. But there's ways out there where you can figure out exactly where people live and how they voted. You can track it that way. But also for us, it's just been really like going into the communities, those finding the people that are from those communities that are willing to organize there and have conversations with people. The first step for us is really, people know what the issues are. People know the struggles that they live with every day. So for us, it's really been just doing the political education piece of it and connecting it, and that means like speaking the language of the folks in the communities that you're trying to reach. So I would say we are just really intentional about what type of field organizers that we have, how we train them to be able to go in those communities. And yeah, and from there just figure out how like what their needs are, and how the civic engagement work can fit into that.
And I think for us, in terms of the different approaches, I think that so all of our work has been focused on infrequent voters. And so one of the things that's been really critical for us too is really mapping out for folks kind of geographically in the city of Chicago to be able to show um, how votes have actually been intentionally suppressed based on where electeds do their own outreach. And so that's been a really useful political education tool in terms of not just reaching out to infrequent voters, but then actually show it and how it's part of a larger system of voter suppression. And then I think I'm just looking at the questions now in terms of the work with schools. So we've done a lot of work around service learning and partnering with teachers who have been involved with the organizing work to get their classes involved as volunteers in getting out the vote and reaching other students. But I think that in thinking about the students who are the most disenfranchised, who also may be the least connected to school, it's really been also through our work around student push out and the school to prison pipeline to make sure that we're both kind of incorporating it more broadly into the fabric of the school, but then also that based on just our organizing work, we're reaching those young people who, again, may not be as connected to their local school, but are passionate about the organizing work. So I think that for anyone, whether it's students with disabilities or other folks, and again, I'm looking at the questions, I think for us, we always get, the question about like, well, why should I vote? What difference is it going to make? So it always has to be connected for us to an active organizing campaign instead of kind of an abstract notion of why it's a good thing. And that's for us what makes the big difference. So in addition to making that first contact or the multiple contacts around getting folks out to vote, it's about having ongoing communication about the active campaigns and what difference it's going to make.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And for us, because we are doing this, like we're not as established when it comes to this type of work yet. It's been a great way of really like what we say like catching the bodies, right? So when you're out canvassing, you're surveying like what people care about, and they're like, oh yeah, you guys work on zero tolerance, you guys work on this. I like that. That's a way to like invite them in, right? So getting them to go through like a fellowship or a leadership training or something like that, and then from there, kind of folding them into the organizing that's happening. So even if you don't have an active campaign, they could be a part of having something puts yeah.
Right. Last question we'll take now, and then we'll move on to sharing some of FCYO's findings. Then we'll come back for a few more questions at the end. Somebody asked a question here about what you do about working. This is in her community. There are 23 different languages spoken. What have you found about doing this work around those for whom English is not their main language?
That's a great question. So we have similar challenges in one of the communities where we were founded. Actually, there are 40 languages spoken in the public school. So it's a port of entry for immigrants and refugees from really all around the world. So that's also a key consideration that we have in doing the work. So we've approached it in different ways. So one is just among our membership base, and when we're able to hire interns and fellows, making sure that all the different language groups are represented. Also in terms of our engagement of institutions, whether it's churches, mosques, universities, student groups, making sure that we have diverse representation with folks who can really do outreach and ways that will reach folks with different cultural backgrounds, different fears of getting involved in the political process based on persecution they may have faced in their home countries, as well as language issues. And then we also do big events too, where we all go vote together. So lots of folks, of course, just go out and vote on their own, but that's also been a critical tool, because especially with things that may seem simple, like the electronic voting machines and things like that, it's incredibly intimidating for many of our members who have disabilities, who have language barriers and other things. And so obviously we can't go into the voting booth with folks, but when we go as a group, we're able to provide supports and do trainings the day of about how to actually go through the voting process and how to actually use the machines, and then do debriefs after, so that folks are connecting the power of that experience to the longer term fight that we're in.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, I was gonna say one more thing too. Something that we use is like doing like peak days, right? So whether it's for example on election day, just making it like a really fun way of approaching the community, right? So I understand you're talking about like a community that's so diverse. For us, like speaking in terms of young people, like we make it like super fun, right? Like we have like a golf cart out there, we drive around, we do parties, we have music, we have free food. So maybe thinking about how you can do that and like target, just making it like a national diverse day. But I would say making it fun and like intentional.
Right. Right. There's one more question before we move on to sharing some of FCYO's findings. There's a question here about whether you are developing campaigns whether you're engaging young people in campaigns that are your organization is already working on, or whether the youth typically design campaigns based on the problems and issues they are seeing in their communities. So are young people joining campaigns that your organizations have already identified, or are the young people identifying the issues themselves?
So do you want to go first, or do you want me?
I can go.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
So for us, the young people design the campaigns based on the issues they're seeing in their communities. So of course, when young people are doing outreach and bringing folks into the civic engagement work, if there are active campaigns, then there is, as they're getting to know other young people, bringing them into the work that they've developed. But all of our work is based out of young people coming together, engaging around the issues that they're facing in their schools and communities, doing root cause analysis, power analysis, and designing the campaigns themselves. And a lot of the time we use participatory action research as one of the tools for young people to really critically analyze the experiences that they're having and to be able to do larger base building and engagement of young people in the development of the solutions that they're creating.
Leah, do you want to speak to that? I think you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so for us, it's both. We have organizing campaigns that we have going on, but also as we engage more people that want to join the organization, there is like we can definitely develop campaigns together. But there is a process because we are a membership organization, so they would have to go through the fellowship and become an official member to actually be able to influence that. But right now, yes, it's both.
Right. So I want to move on now to sharing some of FCYO's findings around youth organizing and voter engagement. But if people have other questions either about this or for our guests, you can continue to put them in the chat. We'll have a few more minutes for Q&A at the end. So over the last couple of years, FCYO has done more work to try to look into this spring together of youth organizing and voter engagement. First, we found that when you combine issue organizing and deep leadership development with voter engagement, it can be a really powerful way to build the power for low-income young people and young people of color. And some of the advantages that we've seen for youth organizing groups who've engaged in this work include building scale and really learning the discipline of mass-based organizing, learning what does it mean to, go out and knock on 1,000 doors and figure out how to engage people at that scale. Second, forcing elected officials to pay attention. I've talked to a lot of youth organizing groups that have said, we couldn't get meetings with elected officials, but once we started doing voter engagement, now now they'll meet with us whenever we want. So the ways that it's supported, people have been able to move forward on their issues and get more attention because they're doing this. And then third, building real political power and preparing to govern. If we're serious about how we're building long-term power and actually going to be able to govern our communities, participating in voter engagement can be a really important strategy. But so let's say people ask some questions about the funding. So let's say a little bit about what we've learned as we've dug into this. So there is some funding for voter engagement work. There are C3 civic engagement funders. And even more importantly, individual political donors that spend a lot of money on supporting voter engagement. Think about, all of the money that goes to parties, that goes to elections, is out there, and people are looking to support folks that are able to turn out voters. But there is a lot of competition for this funding as well. There are a lot of groups that are already in line for civic engagement funding, and some of them have already really demonstrated their capacity to do significant turnout. So it can be difficult to access that funding as a new player in that world. I think another, thing that's important to recognize about funding is that, that funders expect short-term results. This is a really data-driven world, and funders expect groups to register and turn out large numbers of voters, and they will be checking to see whether you do that. And then that strong relationships with civic engagement groups are really key. And I think, both Jenny and I, we had talked about some of the relationships and partners that they've developed. Most states have a C3 civic engagement table. If you want this funding, relationships with these folks are really critical. We've heard some criticism from some of the civic engagement funders that youth organizing groups are too ideological or too radical or too hard to get along with. And, you know, if you want to access this funding, you have to think about how to build strategic alliances with these folks who you may not agree with on everything. And so building those kinds of strong relationships and strategic alliances is really important to accessing this kind of funding. FCYO did a report that's available on our website called Now or Never, The Fight for the Millennial Generation. The report identified 4 roles that youth organizing groups can play that will get to outcomes that civic engagement funders care about. And understanding these 4 roles may be helpful to you in how you talk about your work to civic engagement funders. So I will do a very quick overview of these 4 roles. The first is to identify youth-focused strategic initiatives that can drive public discourse as a way to change the issue environment. Some people may be familiar with George Lakoff's idea of selecting strategic initiatives that can mobilize your base, persuade moderately minded voters, and divide the opposition. So it turns out that the issues that young people are organizing around most, education, immigration, criminal justice reform, all fit this category very nicely. Young people are organizing around these issues can create a more friendly electorate on progressive issues. The recommendation, too, is double down on youth organizing groups with a proven track record in executing large-scale voter engagement programs and identify others with potential to scale up. So as we said, we've seen that there's a number of youth organizing groups that have already producing really good voter engagement results. And we would argue that there's a whole lot of others out there that could do that with the right kind of training and support. Third, shape the millennial generation through highly visible and emotional movement-to-moment campaigns, primarily using communications and organizing methods. So we know that there's a lot of youth organizing groups out there that don't have huge voter universes, but that are able to capitalize on the kind of flashpoints that we've seen a lot of over the last couple of years in ways that can really energize a base, politicize huge numbers of young people, and shift debates. So this kind of movement moment organizing can have a really powerful impact, and it can be combined with voter engagement. The last recommendation here is formalize a leadership pipeline for 21st century youth organizers and related professions, a long-standing gap in the sector, and develop methods to track youth alumni. So the civic engagement sector funders are always really concerned about their lack of a deep bench of future leaders. And youth organizing groups are training hundreds of talented young people, especially young people of color. And too often, some of the alumni that are graduating from our youth organizing groups are lost to the movement because of the lack of connections to support them to stay involved as they become adults. And so a leadership pipeline could be built around connecting youth organizing groups to in-state civic engagement infrastructure, and that's something that funders have expressed a lot of interest in. So this report, it's available on our website. There's a lot more detail there. It was a report that was written for funders more than it was written for youth organizing groups. But we think that talking about these roles and the way that youth organizing groups are playing these roles could be a way of accessing this kind of funding. So last thing I'll say, and then we'll see if there's any final questions that people want to ask. And if you have more questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat again. Is that there's a real opportunity as we look towards 2016. There's a lot of money that's going to be spent on elections. A lot of people are going to be trying to figure out how to reach young people of color. We think there's nobody better to do that work than youth organizing groups. But that said, voter engagement work is not for everybody, and it's fine to have sort of a diversity of approaches within the movement where people focus on different kinds of strategies. But if you think about the 4 roles that we laid out, different groups can play different roles, but there's a lot of power in a theory of change that includes, deep leadership development, issue organizing, moment to movement organizing and voter engagement as part of a sort of a strategy that incorporates all of those approaches. So this is a little bit about what we found at FCYO about accessing those funding. So I'd like to see if there's any other questions that folks on the call have. Any questions that you have either for us at FCYO or for our guests here. I see one more question here about what have you figured out about about being a 501c3, about being a nonprofit organization and doing voter engagement, and how is that, how have you run against the challenges of what kind of voter engagement you can do as a C3? See, either of you want to speak to that question?
Yeah, we just dealt with this because we have voter guides as well. So at the end of each election cycle, we have a voter guide. And you can look it up on our website, OhioStudentAssociation.org. But yeah, so for us, it's been a little bit difficult because we are 501c3, so we can't really pick a side. But recently, we actually have 501c3 and C4. So what we're going to have to do is sort of switch over and maybe have another name so we can kind of be more, more positioned into what kind of issues we want to work on. So that's something that we're going to have to deal with. But we made that choice because we believe in the organizing that's happening on the ground is really critical. So we are willing to go ahead and do a 501c4 so we can actually call out some of these politicians, because we won't be able to do that under a C3.
Yeah. And I think for us, obviously as a 501c3, we're very careful to follow the 501c3 rules and be nonpartisan in all the work that we do. So we're just very conscious about recognizing that it doesn't replace what we do as individuals separately, that this is, but it's a powerful tool for our 501c3 organization. And I think that the benefit it brings is that in addition to stuff that we may do as individuals outside of our professional kind of life in our organization, that then in terms of the dynamic that it creates with our electeds, that they're not in the position then of looking for our endorsement, right? Because we can't even do that, right? That it really is changing the dynamic for them having to be responsive on all the things that we're talking about on a consistent basis. And that kind of political endorsement isn't even part of the equation. So we find that to be a very valuable part of the equation in terms of doing our 501c3 work, and that it's an incredibly powerful leadership development tool that's integrated into our broader organizing. And there's the question here about, can you use political donors to fund 501c3s? So anyone can donate as long as then you use the money according to 501c3 regulations. So even if they're a political donor, they can still give you money to do work. Obviously, if they're a candidate, you wouldn't want to accept money from them to be doing this work. But in terms of other folks, you definitely can. And then I see the question, I thought as a C3 that we can't do candidate work, but we can endorse measures. So we can endorse measures. By measures, I'm not sure if you mean like issue areas that folks are working on or ballot measures. But as C3s, for example, we can support referenda, ballot measures. So ballot measures, I think state laws govern it differently. So I know we've been doing a lot of work learning from the California Proposition 47 efforts around justice reinvestment. And there were very strict laws, is my understanding, around what C3s could do around the ballot measure. Eric, you may have more information around that, but I think that there were some restrictions. Here in Illinois, ballot measures, again, they're a non-binding referendum. And so we have to count that as direct lobbying, but it's but we are allowed to work on them. So there are different ways that we have to track the expenditures and make sure that we're in our limits as a C3. We have an H election to our 501c3, but we can do it. And then I know groups did work on the Prop 47 effort, but I think that was more from the voter engagement turnout standpoint.
Right. I mean, right.
Go ahead.
You know, the short answer, right, is that there's lots of things. You're right. You know, the person asking the question is right that C3s can't endorse candidates, and similarly, where there's binding ballot initiatives, can't take a stance to vote yes or no on a ballot initiative. But what you can do is turn out voters from your community. And there's a lot that can be accomplished by educating, registering, and turn out voters from your community that builds the political power of your community, and that's something that C3s can do. Right. So I think we're about out of time. I want to thank Jenny and Alwea. Thank you so much for sharing all of this information. We really appreciate you all being here and sharing all of this expertise. In wrapping up, I want to remind people we will make this recording and the slides available for anybody that wants to look at this later. We're planning our next webinar for January. The next Youth Core webinar will be in January. Keep your eye out for the date, but we'll be focusing on how youth organizing groups are meeting the social, emotional, and academic needs of young people at the same time as we're organizing. I know many youth organizing groups are really struggling. How do we organize and also meet some of the basic needs that our members have? And what's a holistic approach to youth organizing that incorporates meeting those needs and healing from the trauma that's happening in many communities? So that will be the focus of the next Youth Core webinar in January. Keep looking for the date. Please, please, please fill out the survey. We have a link here to just a very short evaluation form. And we'll put this in the chat so that you can click it as well. But if you can just go and quickly fill out an evaluation, we really want feedback on this webinar, what worked, and on topics that you'd like to see for webinars for the future. So it's a very short survey. It won't take you very long. But if you have just 2 minutes to quickly fill out this survey, your feedback on it would be greatly appreciated. So you can see the link to the survey is in the chat right now. So thank you all again to our guests. Thanks to everybody for joining this. If you have any other questions about Youth Core, any of this work, please feel free to get in touch with us at FCYO. And please do fill out the evaluation as we want your feedback on all this. Thanks so much and look forward to being in touch soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Jenny and Alwea, thank you so much. That was great.
Yeah, no problem. I just sent my email and the voter guide in case people want to check it out.
Oh, great. That's great.